Hi, my name is Keating, and I've taught here at North Central for more than 25 years. One of the courses that I most love teaching is Chicago history, and it's an area that I've done most of my research and my publications have been in Chicago history. And when we came to the pandemic this spring and summer, it's a surprise that I've been thinking about how we can use what we know about Chicago history to better understand the role of pandemics and epidemics in our lives. It's not that history repeats itself, that we can find specific answers to our questions. It's more broad contours of what took place in the past to give us a sense of where we are now and where we may be headed in the future. So I want to spend a little bit of time with you today talking about how epidemics have shaped Chicago history. There's a few things that, as we start, I think are worth noting. They're things that I've been thinking a lot about over the last few months. The first one is that, until 100 years ago, epidemics and pandemics were pretty much a constant part of life. They were a everyday part of life for urban residents of cities like Chicago, whether it was cholera, typhoid, smallpox, TB, measles, all kinds of infectious diseases. Often epidemics and pandemics raged. It's not until really the 1920s that the public health in the United States and in a city like Chicago improves to a point where epidemics and pandemics and widespread contagious disease is really reined in. And so in my lifetime, I have experienced few epidemic moments, and until now, nothing like this pandemic. So it's foreign to my experience over my lifetime. But one of the things I've learned from Chicago history is that it is more that I have lived in a exceptional time rather than in an unexceptional time. The rule here for most of this history is that epidemics and pandemics were rampant. Another thing that I have found that I think is interesting for us to be thinking about is the idea of whose responsibility, where the responsibility for addressing the pandemic or epidemic, where the responsibility lies. And it's really important to see that for much of the 19th and into the 20th century, it's really local communities, it's villages, it's cities, it's towns that take responsibility for their own health, and that they're going to be most responsible. Federal government is going to become a player in this story as it takes up the question of public health more generally by the mid-20th century. So we're going to see a role for the federal government, but the base role is local governments respond. And that's, I think, again, worth noting and thinking about where that responsibility should lie and where it's lied over the course of time. A third thing that I think it's really worth noting before I jump into some examples here is that pandemics and epidemics affect the most vulnerable in our society and in past societies. So that has meant that children, immigrants, people of color, poor people generally, people who have been ostracized in one way or another, whether mental health issues or emotional problems, those are all people that have suffered the most in past epidemics and pandemics. And I think that's another interesting point for me as I think about what the past tells us about where we are today. Okay, so you see here Chicago flag over here on your left, and 4 stars in the Chicago flag have traditionally meant First one's Fort Dearborn. The second one is the 1871 Chicago fire. The third one is for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, with Chicago showing off to the world that it's the city of the century. The fourth one is to celebrate the centennial of Chicago's founding as a town in 1933 with the Century of Progress Fair. And so that's been kind of a tight little look at Chicago history through 4 stars, those 4 moments that we want to highlight. History's great, to my mind, because we don't have to stick to those 4 stars and what they mean. History means we can dip in the past and think about different ways, different things that have meaning for us today. And so I'd like to suggest that we could, if we chose to, rethink these 4 stars to not be celebrations of moments when we want to celebrate for Chicago, but instead, it might be celebration in the sense of Chicago has forward. So it could be 4 stars with 4 epidemics, 4 pandemics, 4 responses to contagious diseases or public health threats that have been successfully managed and responded to. At any rate, we're going to have a chance to talk at the end of this of my remarks, and if you've got any thoughts about what those 4 stars might mean now in an epidemic, in the pandemic age, I'll look forward to hearing from you on that. So let's begin. The first documented pandemic that comes to Chicago is cholera, and cholera is a really dreadful disease. People contract it generally through contaminated water. It's not completely known, really. It's really the 1850s before that becomes clear, and it's going to be decades later before germ theory makes it even better understood. But cholera is a highly contagious disease, and people catch it. They often begin to feel symptoms within a matter of hours, and it's a disease that you dehydrate quickly. So it's a dysentery-like disease, and people die really within 24 hours. The stories that I carry in my head of cholera victims in 19th century Chicago are simply that they went to work, they came home from work, they didn't feel well, and the next morning they were dead. And so it's that kind of a disease. 1832, though, let's go back over here. I've got 2 slides here, and let me start with the one on the right. The one on the right, probably a little hard for you to see, but let me talk you through it because I just want you to mark this. So 1832, Chicago is still an Indian country. That is, the territory is controlled by Native Americans, by the Potawatomi, by the Sauk, by the Ho-Chunk, by the Miami, and their allies. And each one of the triangles that you see in the map on the left is an Indian village in the early 1830s. And this map gives you a sense then that Chicago, Fort Dearborn, is an outpost in Indian country during these years. Now, 1832 on the left, the United States is trying to negotiate with Native Americans to take this land and survey it and sell it to American settlers moving west. So to expropriate this land from Native Americans, move Americans west, and move in a wholly new population. Black Hawk resists that. Black Hawk and Sauk warriors who are moved by him attack American settlements in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois in 1830. The U.S. Army sends out troops. Winfield Scott brings companies of troops to Chicago by ship from Detroit. They bring cholera with them. Cholera in 1832 is a worldwide pandemic. It's in cities across Europe, across the United States, and Scott brings it with his troops. So his troops are languishing, his soldiers are languishing at Chicago, sick and dying at Chicago. But when he brings this ship in, he's also going to, Scott and his troops are going to bring cholera out to this whole battlefield area, so across northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. And within a matter of months, months, Native Americans, the Sauk warriors under Black Hawk, as well as U.S. troops, as well as Indian villagers, as well as American settlers, are all contracting this disease. And it really has an effect on this story in that it makes it very difficult to wage this war. And the Sauk warriors are subdued. The American government steps in and demands in a treaty in 1833 that all of the lands map on your right become American territory. So it's really the starting story of Chicago, and this move away from Native American control are also tied very much to cholera. Now, cholera will revisit Chicago in beginning in 1848, so a couple of decades later. So Chicago begins to grow as an American town in the 1830s and 1840s, selling real estate, beginning trade with these new farmers that have gone into the region. And they're also involved with building transportation. 1848 is an important year because the Illinois-Michigan Canal is going to open, linking the Great Lakes with the Mississippi River. 1848 is also the year first railroad line running west from downtown Chicago through a park out to Wheaton is going to begin the process of going out towards Galena, out to the Mississippi River. Also the year that the Board of Trade is organized. Chicago's got about 30,000 people living in it in 1848, so it's beginning to be a real place in the American landscape. Cholera, a second wave of this pandemic strikes the world, and it comes to Chicago up this newly opened Illinois and Michigan Canal, and Chicagoans have to confront this dreadful disease once again. The people that had been there in the 1830s are going to confront this again here. Now, by the 1830s, this is a town. It's got newspapers. There are churches that are going to respond. There's a local government that can respond. What you start to see immediately is, and we see here in the newspaper headlines here on the right from Chicago newspapers in the 1840s, 1850s, is that the city of Chicago, it's a city after 1837, the city of Chicago will place a quarantine on anyone coming in or out, trying to trade. So you're going to quarantine a ship coming in particular. So you cannot just step Chicago off the ship, and you can't leave. So the city itself goes to a point that the city government imposes, and then there's also people within the city who get cholera, who are identified with cholera, are also quarantined. So we're going to see the emergence of the first hospitals in Chicago in response to cholera here in 1848, 1849, and 1850. There's going to be more responses because cholera will continue to come through every summer. Cholera is a summertime disease, and by the early 1850s, thousands of people losing lives or being sick, and some of those thousands dying in 1840, 1850, 1851. By 1851, city government says, okay, we got a pretty good idea that we have to have a better, cleaner water supply if we're going to deal with cholera. And again, no germ theory, not clear. There's a linkage with water, but they got to, it's becoming increasingly clear that cleanliness, and particularly clean water, are important to this story. In London, just in the same year, John was figuring that contaminated well water was the way cholera was being spread in neighborhoods in London. At any rate, in Chicago, the city decides to do a couple of things. One, they say we're going to have a water system, a public water system, and two, we're going to have a public sewerage system. They're going to go the water for the water supply system from the lake, and they're going to put their sewage into the river. So in the early 1850s, we start to see that emerge. Cholera will go into abeyance, but it's going to come back in the mid-1860s. So we're going to see a third wave of cholera in the city. And by that point, there's fear, and not unfounded. There's a fear that Chicago's water is highly contaminated, even though it's a public water system, because they're taking water right from the shoreline. And the shoreline by early 1860s is highly polluted with the sewage coming from the river, storage system, and also just garbage being dumped in industries, because Chicago is increasingly an industrial center. So Chicago creates a second technological fix that they're going to use to stop a pandemic, and that is they're going to create a 1 mile tunnel under Lake Michigan for a water intake tunnel that's going to end at this, and this is on the right here, this image, at this familiar place. I hope it's familiar to you. It's the water tower that still stands on Michigan Avenue. And it was the end point, still is the end point for this lake tunnel, where the water is going to be taken in from much further out in the lake, so that you're getting clean water, not contaminated by the sewage from the city. And you know, the thing is, it works. Cholera cholera cases decline. And for a period of time, Chicago is going to be a city that's safer from disease, although we could go down another rabbit hole, not from fire. And so that water supply did not keep Chicago from burning down in a couple of years. Cholera, though, is not the only pandemic epidemic that we're going to see across the 19th century. Another big one that affects Chicago for decades, really across the 1880s and 1890s, is typhoid. And typhoid, like cholera, is a waterborne disease. And it's greatly feared, and it's going to kill thousands of people in Chicago over the 1880s and 1890s. The solution that's created for this, again, is a technological fix, is a major infrastructure improvement. And that infrastructure improvement is to reverse the flow of the Chicago River so that the sewage and industrial waste from the Chicago River doesn't flow into Lake Michigan, but instead is going to flow down to St. Louis. Now, you can imagine people in St. Louis are not happy with Chicago sending all of its waste down to the Mississippi River. And they try and sue, but it's to no avail. In 1900, the Sanitary and Ship Canal, built by the Sanitary District of Chicago, permanently reverses the flow of the Chicago River so that water flows in from Lake Michigan and will flow down to the Mississippi River, and it will take garbage and sewage and waste away from the water supply, and it greatly improves the health of Chicagoans and reduces the number of typhoid cases that we see in the city. Now, on the left-hand side, you'll see a poster for typhoid fever, which rages in Chicago during the 1893 World's Fair. And there's tremendous fear that the outbreak is going to be so large that it will damage Chicago's reputation and will keep people, that million plus people, from coming to Chicago to visit, millions plus people from coming to visit the fair. And this is a representation here on the slide of typhoid kind of taking over the 1893 World's Fair. Well, it's on Daniel Burnham's mind, and it's something that he's going to spend a lot of time making sure that the White City is a sanitary city, that it's very clean, that water supply is clean. And so it's very much tied up, the 1893 and the idea of a White City, with trying to sell Chicago and the rest of the world on the idea that Chicago is in fact a healthy place to come and visit. There are other chronic diseases which reach epidemic proportion at various points across the 19th and into the 20th century. And I just want to mention two more that really affect Chicago. On your left, you've got smallpox. And smallpox is, again, a disease that, in fact, there's been a successful vaccine for from the 18th century. The problem is, by the late 19th century in Chicago, Chicago's population hits 1 million in 1890. It's going to be 3 million by 1930, really growing dramatically. Lots of very poor people coming to Chicago to take up jobs in industry and any other place that jobs can be had. The issue then becomes smallpox runs rampant in many of the poorest quarters of Chicago. And it's in the early 20th century that the Department of Health in Chicago begins to marshal resources in order to provide public vaccination, free vaccination for children of the children of Chicago. And again, they're going to launch a campaign, and we see a broadside here, a pamphlet here, of to educate, and education will be really important, that the vaccine is available, that it's free, that children should have it to keep smallpox at bay. And so that's again, this 20th century, we see finally this vaccine being distributed and inoculations going up in the city so that more and more people are vaccinated. So smallpox will again retreat because of this vaccine and its successful, that it's successfully used across the city. On the right, you've got another poster, and this is the crusade against tuberculosis. And the tuberculosis is another scourge that affects Chicago across the 19th and into the 20th century. And the response to tuberculosis is different, again, from cholera, from typhoid, from smallpox. Part of it is that there is no inoculation. There is no vaccine for TB as there was for smallpox. And it's not tied to water supply like you've got with cholera and typhoid. So there isn't these big technological fixes. Instead, with tuberculosis, by the early, by the 19-teens, there's a decision on the part of public health. And in this case, it's Cook County or DuPage County. So the county health offices have made a decision that they've got to reduce the number of tuberculosis cases, particularly amongst the poor who are living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in Chicago. And so there's a tax placed on Chicagoans that they're going to support a response to tuberculosis. And that tax will help to fund a visiting nurses association. The visiting nurses will go out into the most densely populated areas of Chicago to identify people who have tuberculosis, to pull them out of their families, their neighborhoods, and have them live at sanitariums at a distance from the city center for as long as they have symptoms and until they start to feel better. And again, as a way of treating the disease, treating the symptoms, but also taking people who are highly contagious out of the dense weave of the city center. And so you see the creation of the Metropolitan the Metropolitan Tuberculosis Sanitarium in 1917 in Chicago, and it's going to run into the 1970s. So again, what's the solution here to TB? It's really to identify and quarantine the individuals who have this disease as a way of regulating tuberculosis, which will be then aided by the middle part of the 20th century with penicillin and antibiotic treatments that will help to manage tuberculosis and make it less fatal and a more manageable disease. But again, different kinds of approaches and different public health responses to these very, very different kinds of epidemics. About 100 years ago, 1819, 100 years and a couple more years, we get the Chicago influenza pandemic. Chicago is a part of this worldwide Spanish flu pandemic that begins during World War I. And so our understanding of this disease and how it travels is really circumscribed by the fact that the countries engaged in World War I really tried to keep a lid on how many cases they had amongst their troops in their countries. Why? Because that was seen as dangerous to the success of their fighting World War I. And so it's often called the Spanish flu because Spain was a neutral country during World War I and was willing to actually put in their newspapers reporting on the Spanish flu. In the United States, Spanish flu, the influenza of 1918, in many ways is brought to the country through U.S. Army installations. So it's soldiers themselves who have been exposed to influenza who bring it to the United States. So one of the first places where we see the outbreak of influenza is in Kansas. Here in the Chicago area, it's Great Lakes Naval Training Station as well as Fort Sheridan are two of the first places, so up on the North Shore along Lake Michigan, two of the first places with known cases of influenza, and it's going to spread from there across the region. And what you see here in front of you are Army nurses, right? So one of the things here that we want to keep in mind is that the federal government has to respond to the pandemic in as much as they're going to have to take care of the U.S. Army. And you see that actually here on North Central's campus because the college during World War I has got an Army training center here on campus. And the Army actually sets up a small hospital ward in Goldspawn Hall to take care of soldiers and recruits that have come down with the influenza while they're at North Central College, which was then Northwestern College. But for the most part, the influenza pandemic is going to be managed, and the response is going to come from the cities and villages across the region, from Chicago, from Naperville, from Oak Park, from Evanston, not from the federal government or even from the state government. It's really going to be the local areas that do that. And so in Chicago, you're going to find a lot of closures and things that are going to be familiar to us today. So, and you see here on the right some of the headlines. Saloons, barring non-essential crowds, so not big groups, saloons, theaters, restaurants, all closed down. What didn't close down, in contrast, again, which is interesting, is schools for the most part stayed open. There are a couple exceptions. I mean, Evanston's going to close their schools for a period of time, and churches and synagogues also remain open during the pandemic. But you'll see here in the bottom right-hand side that church windows must stay open, right? So trying to mitigate as best they can this. There's also a lot of public health suggestions for public health, and that is the idea of covering your mouth, of wearing a mask, of not smoking in public, of avoiding sneezing, of avoiding other people, right, as much as possible was a big piece of this story. And you see this kind of broadside. Again, the Commission of Health is issuing this and posting. These are going to be posted on places that are closed because of the pandemic in 1918 and in 1919. And I think it's interesting to read a little bit of the wording here to think about how it's similar and different to what we have today. Influenza, frequently complicated with pneumonia, is prevalent at this time throughout America. This theater, so this was posted on a theater in a closed theater in Chicago, is cooperating with the Department of Health. You must do the same. And then they give you some instructions. If you have a cold and are coughing and sneezing, you know, they're saying, don't come in. And most of the time, you're not even going to be able to come in. Go home and go to bed until you are well. Coughing, sneezing, or spitting will not be permitted, you know, until we go on. We also see, again, a lot of changes on public transportation. You could smoke on the streetcars and on the elevated in Chicago into the pandemic in 1918. Smoking is prohibited because you're supposed to be wearing a mask, so you can't smoke. And what's interesting to my mind after the pandemic is no smoking is one of the few things that actually endure after the pandemic ends in 1919. As I said in my opening remarks, and I want to remind us of this, after this 1918-1919 pandemic, we're going to enter a period in which public health in the United States improves dramatically. The mortality rate from infectious diseases, from epidemics, drops precipitously. So that in the course of my lifetime, I have not been very much affected by epidemics and pandemics. But there are certainly things we certainly see epidemics and pandemics continuing to happen, and they do have an effect. And I just wanted to talk about two of these, polio, and to say a few words about HIV-AIDS, because I think both of these are more circumscribed epidemics that still very much affect Chicago and its public health. So polio. Polio is not a new disease in the 1920s, but in fact, improving public health, interestingly, gives polio an entree into people's bodies. And we're going to see an uptick in polio cases across the country and in the Chicago area in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Polio is a disease that basically leads to paralysis, sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent, depends on the person. And it's a disease where, again, the onset is quick. People go to bed at night, they wake up from their sleep and they can't move. So it's a terrifying disease in that way. It's also a disease that affected children more than adults. And so you'll see that one of the big things that takes place is periodic closures of schools, as we saw in Chicago in 1937, as a way of trying to keep polio from spreading. Once you had polio, if you were paralyzed and you could not breathe on your own, probably the most terrifying instrument of the polio era are these iron lungs. And the iron lung would be used to artificially pump air in and out of your lungs until you could recover. So these wards were a part of the Chicago psyche and the American psyche in the 1940s and 1950s. And so parents during the summer, because polio was spread more rapidly in the summer, in the summertime, many parents wouldn't let their children use swimming pools. Swimming pools were, summer fun at the lake was reduced dramatically. You didn't have big picnics or events because you needed to protect children from the possibility of getting polio. The end to polio, to this rolling epidemic that takes place year after year for decades, comes in 1954 when doctors Sabin and Salk develop a vaccine. So they develop a cure for polio. And what's interesting to me, for us to keep in mind, is this polio vaccine then is really developed in 54. You're going to see it begin to be tested out in 1955. In 1956, it's going to be rapidly administered to beginning children across Chicago and the region here by Cook County and by DuPage County, and then across the country as well. And what's interesting one of the interesting things about this, from my perspective, and we see here a child being inoculated, is that the public health departments get involved in this with setting up clinics, and the clinics are often set up in schools. These free clinics are also set up in park district buildings, field houses, so that you can get this vaccine out as quickly as possible and end the scourge of polio. And it's a very successful vaccination process. And as I think about where we might be headed if a vaccine is found for the COVID virus, that we're really thinking about how do you get that out to as many people as quickly as possible. And polio offers us some interesting ideas there. The last epidemic that I think we want to have in mind in Chicago in the 20th century is HIV-AIDS, which is, beginning in 1980, begins to kill hundreds of Chicagoans annually. By 1993, in fact, one of the high years, more than 1,000 Chicagoans died from this disease. And from the standpoint of what we've been talking about already here today, a couple things to keep in mind. There has never been a successful vaccine, right, to treat HIV/AIDS. So it is in that way much more like, it's a disease that, again, it's without, it's like influenza. It's without an immunization that will treat it, that will cure it. Instead, what's taken place is the treatments have been developed so that HIV/AIDS is no longer a terminal disease. It's not a fatal disease, but instead becomes a chronic illness. So it's another way that an epidemic can be put at bay, is by finding treatments that make it a chronic rather than a fatal disease, which again is something for us to think about as we contemplate where we're headed this summer and this fall. So I'm going to stop, and I'll be taking your questions here in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to note that if you're interested in getting more information about Chicago and epidemics, I encourage you to look at the Encyclopedia of Chicago. I was one of the co-editors. It's a project that was first published in 2004, and you can find it for free at www.encyclopedia.chicagohistory.org. It's on the Chicago History Museum's website. If you just Google Chicago Encyclopedia, you'll come to it fairly quickly. When you're there, you will find a number of entries, I think, that will add to what you know about Chicago. Demography, epidemics, water-related epidemics, water supply, and public health are some of the entries to get started with to learn more about public health and epidemics in Chicago history. And then we're back. I'll close up here with the Chicago flag and those 4 stars. Are you thinking now maybe we've got different things? We could have an epidemic flag with cholera and typhoid, or cholera, and we could have Black Hawk, and we could have the 1 mile water intake. We could have the reversal of the Chicago River, and that 4th star could be, I don't know, something here in the 20th century, or perhaps it's left here for our response to the COVID. But I look forward to talking with you and answering your questions. Take care.